Today we're tackling the most loved and hated quilt block. Can you guess what it is? Welcome back to 3 Ways To. My name is Jenna, and today we are sewing one of my least favorite blocks that have turned into one of my most favorite blocks, and it is the half square triangle. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways to sew a half square triangle. In the quilting world, I feel like half square triangles are the most versatile and really the most used like individual quilts block square out there. And anytime a pattern says just make one half square triangle, in my mind, I think, well, I can just cut my square an inch bigger and make 2 and then have a bunch left over. Today, we are going to learn 2 at a time, 4 at a time, and 8 at a time half square triangles. Well, let's jump to it. We're starting with our 2 at a time half square triangles, and I am just gonna need 2 pieces of fabric. I want all of the half square triangles that I'm making today to finish to 3 inches. That means like when I trim them down, it's gonna be 3 inches squared. And you probably don't wanna make 3-inch half square triangles all the time because that is super tiny. So I did the calculations for you. I made a free half square triangle calculator. It comes with the instructions for all 3 ways that I'm gonna show you today on how to do these half square triangles, plus a calculator where you can enter in, like if you want a, let's say 5.5-inch square, you can just put that in and it will give you the dimensions of what you need to cut. But let's get started with 2 at a time. First, I'm going to take my square and I am going to choose one of my pieces and I'm going to mark it diagonally down the center. So I'll lay these on top of each other, right sides together, and then I'll do a nice little pin. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch on either side of that line that I drew. One of my favorite tricks with a little half square triangle is oftentimes I find that whenever I make these, because a point is going into the machine, sometimes it goes down into the feed dogs and it just gets tangled, or it like the thread just, you know? So I like to use a leader piece of fabric, and all it is just a scrap piece of fabric that you just put first and you sew. And then once you put your piece in there, it's less likely to go into the machine, and that's my little trick. Then we're gonna go down the other side. How easy was that? Our next step is to cut straight down that line that we drew. And now we can press these babies open. When you sew a half square triangle, because you are sewing diagonally, you're sewing on something called the bias. So if you see I'm pulling this way and this way, my fabric's not really stretching, but if I pull this way, it is stretching, and that's called the bias. And when you are making half square triangles, you want to try to stretch it the least amount as possible. So one of my little tricks for pressing is I like to take the edge of my iron and run it up against the edge of my seam line first, and then I'll fold it over and press on top. Also with half square triangles, I love using starch, and starch helps just make your fabric a little bit stiffer and helps it stretch less. Some people like to starch them before, but I just like to starch them during. So we got one. Let's do that again. Go along the edge of that line, go over the top. I'll do a little starchy. And we've got our 2 at a time half square triangles. Our next step is to trim them because they did stretch a little, because we did sew on that bias and press on that bias. But first, let's do 4 at a time and 8 at a time half square triangles, and then I'll show you my little tips and tricks to trimming these babies. For 4 at a time half square triangles, we are going to lay 2 square pieces together right on top of each other, and I am just going to pin these guys so they stay in place. Then I'm going to sew a box all around the perimeter of the square using my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Our next step is to cut corner to corner to make a X. And we're gonna go this way. And are you ready? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 at a time, half square triangles, and then you're just gonna press them the same way we did before. I forgot to tell y'all, with 4 at a time half square triangles, when we cut that line, we cut our half square triangles on the bias, so they're gonna be a little bit stretchier on that straight edge. I don't make 4 at a time super often just because of that, because you have to worry about stretching, especially when you're sewing all of these together. So if you are gonna do 4 at a time half square triangles, I highly, highly, highly recommend using starch. And then it makes it a little bit easier to sew all together, and you just have to be aware that you are sewing on that bias, so your fabric may stretch a little bit as you're sewing. Last but not least, 8 at a time half square triangles. We're gonna start with 2 bigger squares because we need 8 half square triangles out of this, right? And on one of the squares, I am going to draw an X from corner to corner. And I like to start in the middle and work my way out, because then that shifts the fabric a little bit less, especially in those corners. Now I can line these guys up. Now we're gonna sew a 1/4 inch on both sides of the lines that we drew. We've sewn on either side of the lines, and now we are going to do our cuts. And the first cut I am going to do is I'm going to do our diagonal cuts. So I'm going to go through the middle of both of those seam lines. Oopsies, I should have probably put the guide on this, or the guide, and so I could hook it onto the track, because I just slipped and cut a little bit too much. But that's okay, I'm gonna put the track on this guy, and then it will be a little bit easier. Okay, we're just gonna switch this out really fast, easy peasy. Okay, now we gotta cut down the middle of these guys, and I gotta do some math. So I'm gonna measure in 4 inches from the side, and I'm gonna line up with the top. Here, there we go. 4 inches from the bottom. Okay. And now we got our 8 at a time half square triangles. I feel like this is the one I use the most often, just because it makes the most, and it's the most efficient. Anytime you make half square triangles, I highly encourage you to trim them. Technically, you don't have to, but for more precise piecing and for your points to line up together a little bit better, highly recommend trimming them. Trimming these guys are super duper easy. It is a little bit time consuming, but it is easier and it makes for a better finished product. So on my ruler, I've got a 45-degree angle right here, and I'm gonna line up that line with that seam line in the middle. And I just like using a square ruler for these. You can use a rectangle, you can use whatever you have at home. I just find a square ruler is a little bit easier. You're gonna trim it down on one side, and then I can flip this around, and now I can line up my 3-inch mark on my ruler right here and right here with that edge that we cut, and I can trim it down. And now we got a perfectly trimmed half square triangle. With half square triangles, I will say that trimming is what takes forever, but it really is worth it. And that's why a lot of people hate half square triangles, is just because it does take a long time to trim. But the quilts that you can make with half square triangles are insane. There are so many free half square triangle quilt patterns out on the internet, and I feel like they're just really easy to manipulate, where you can kind of come up with your own quilt pattern. One of my favorite half square triangle quilt patterns is Postcard from Sweden. I made one and I gave it to my friend, and it was the most beautiful quilt. It was just so colorful. I love it. Look how easy that was. Now we got our finished trimmed half square triangles to turn into a fun project. In the comments, let me know your favorite half square triangle pattern. They're so versatile. You can do so much with them, and that is why I love them and hate them, because they just take forever to make, but they make the most beautiful quilts. So in the comments, let me know, what's your favorite quilt pattern to make with half square triangles? And if you're like me and forget things easily and want the instructions for the 2 at a time, 4 at a time, and 8 at a time half square triangles, plus the quilting calculator that tells you what size squares to start with, the link is in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me for 3 ways to make a half square triangle. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to press that like button and subscribe for more quilting content. I'll see you next time.